There was a time when you began to suspect that something about you was fundamentally wrong, though no one ever said it directly. It was in the pauses after you spoke, in the subtle glances exchanged across the room, in the way conversations shifted the moment you tried to defend yourself. You became the explanation for tension you did not create, the reason for storms that were already forming long before you entered the room. When something broke, eyes turned toward you. When emotions rose, your name seemed to hover unspoken in the air. Over time, you stopped asking whether it was fair. You simply accepted the role. You learned to apologize quickly, to shrink your reactions, to monitor your tone, to carry responsibility for peace even when chaos was not yours to hold. And without ceremony, without discussion, without your consent, you were assigned a position in a story that was never written by you. What makes this role so powerful is that it is rarely loud. It does not arrive with dramatic declarations. It seeps in quietly through repetition. A comment here, a comparison there, a reminder of your sensitivity, your intensity, your difference. Slowly, a narrative forms around you, and the most dangerous part is not that others believe it. It is that you begin to believe it. You start to question your memory, your perception, your instincts. You replay conversations at night, searching for the flaw in yourself that must explain why you are always the common denominator in conflict. But being the common denominator does not mean being the cause. Sometimes it simply means you are the one willing to speak, the one who feels deeply, the one who does not pretend that everything is fine when it clearly is not. In many systems, especially within families or close relationships, balance is often maintained not through truth but through silence. Unspoken disappointments, unresolved pain, hidden insecurities, they need somewhere to go. And when those emotions are too uncomfortable to confront directly, they are redirected, placed onto the shoulders of the one person strong enough to endure it. The scapegoat is rarely the weakest. More often, they are the most perceptive. They sense the inconsistency between words and actions. They question contradictions. They refuse, even unconsciously, to participate in illusions. And when a system depends on illusion for survival, the one who sees clearly becomes a threat. Not because they are wrong, but because they are accurate. So the story shifts. The tension in the household is no longer about unspoken resentments. It is about your attitude. The emotional distance is no longer about avoidance. It is about your behavior. The recurring conflict is no longer about deeper fractures. It is about your reaction. And each time the narrative circles back to you, the structure stabilizes itself temporarily. The real issues remain untouched. The discomfort is contained. And you, carrying guilt that was never yours, try harder. You become more agreeable, more accommodating, more self-aware than anyone around you. You work tirelessly to fix dynamics you did not break, believing that if you could just perfect yourself, the atmosphere would finally soften. But here is the truth that changes everything. You were never chosen because you were flawed. You were chosen because you were capable. Capable of absorbing pressure, capable of enduring misunderstanding, capable of surviving isolation. The role was not evidence of your inadequacy, it was evidence of your strength, and strength when misunderstood is often exploited. There comes a moment, quiet but irreversible, when you begin to see the pattern, when you realize that no amount of self-correction ever truly solved the problem because you were never the problem to begin with. That realization can feel disorienting at first. If you are not at fault, then the foundation of what you were taught begins to crack. But within that crack is freedom. Freedom from rehearsing apologies for existing. Freedom from carrying emotional burdens that do not belong to you. Freedom from confusing responsibility with self-erasure. You were the scapegoat, the one who carried what others refused to face, the one who held the tension so the structure would not collapse. And it was never your fault. Not then. Not now. The weight you carried was assigned, not earned. And the moment you understand that, deeply, without hesitation, something within you stands taller, not in anger, not in revenge, but in clarity. And clarity is the beginning of reclaiming your power. The silent assignment, how the role was given to you. There was no meeting, no announcement, no clear decision made in your presence, and yet, somehow, the role was handed to you with absolute certainty. It happened quietly, through patterns rather than proclamations. One day you noticed that when something went wrong, your name surfaced first. When tension filled the air, your reactions were examined more closely than the cause of the tension itself. You became the explanation that required the least resistance. It was easier to say you were too sensitive than to admit someone else was emotionally unavailable. It was simpler to label you difficult than to confront long-standing resentment. So the narrative formed, not because it was true, but because it was convenient. In many families and close systems, stability is often maintained through unspoken agreements. These agreements are rarely healthy, but they are predictable. Someone becomes the hero, someone becomes the peacekeeper, and sometimes someone becomes the one who carries the blame. The scapegoat is not selected randomly. The role is often assigned to the one who senses what others ignore, the one who asks questions when silence would be safer, the one who reacts honestly to dishonesty. When you refused, even subtly, to pretend that everything was perfect, you disrupted a fragile balance, and instead of adjusting the system adjusted the story about you. Over time, repetition turned assumption into identity. If you heard often enough that you were the cause of conflict, you began to look inward for defects. You monitored your tone, you filtered your words, you replayed conversations late into the night, searching for the moment you must have crossed a line. But the line was never clearly drawn, because it was never truly about behavior. It was about containment. Your role was to absorb the discomfort that others did not want to process. When frustration needed an outlet, it moved toward you. When disappointment needed direction, it pointed at you. And because you valued harmony, you tried to carry it with grace. What makes the silent assignment so powerful is that it often begins early. Perhaps when you were young, you expressed emotions strongly. Perhaps you questioned authority. Perhaps you simply reacted naturally to inconsistency. Instead of being guided, you were labeled. Instead of being understood, you were categorized. And once a label takes root in a system, it becomes self-reinforcing. Every mistake confirms it. Every misunderstanding strengthens it. Even your attempts to defend yourself are interpreted as proof that you are the problem. The more you try to step outside the role, the tighter it seems to hold you. But here is what must be understood. A role assigned in silence does not define your identity. It defines the limitations of the system that created it. You were not chosen because you were weak. You were chosen because you were visible, because your awareness threatened denial, because your honesty unsettled comfort. The silent assignment says far more about the environment than it ever did about you. And the moment you see how the role was given, without your consent, without fairness, without truth, you begin to loosen its grip, not with anger, not with rebellion, but with clarity. And clarity is where freedom begins. The burden of false guilt, carrying what was never yours. False guilt does not arrive as a sudden weight. It settles slowly, like dust you do not notice accumulating until everything feels heavy. At first, it seems reasonable. You assume responsibility because you care. You apologize because you value harmony. You reflect on your behavior because you want to grow. But over time, reflection turns into self-doubt, and responsibility turns into self-blame. You begin to feel accountable not only for your actions, but for other people's moods, reactions, and disappointments. If someone is distant, you wonder what you did. If tension rises, you search your memory for the mistake. And eventually, guilt becomes your default setting. Not because you are guilty, but because you have been conditioned to believe you must be. The burden of false guilt is especially heavy because it feels moral. You tell yourself that being accountable is a strength, that taking ownership is mature, and it is when the ownership is real. But what you were carrying was not growth. It was absorption. You absorbed frustration that did not originate with you. You absorbed criticism rooted in someone else's insecurity. You absorbed emotional volatility that had nothing to do with your character. And because you were the one willing to examine yourself, you became the safest place for misplaced blame to land. Over time, this constant internal interrogation reshapes your identity. You hesitate before speaking, not because you lack intelligence, but because you fear triggering conflict. You soften your opinions, not because they are invalid, but because you have learned that strong perspectives lead to subtle punishment. You begin to apologize for things that require no apology, for asking questions, for needing clarity, for expressing emotion. And the most painful part is that you may not even realize how much you are shrinking. It feels normal, it feels responsible, it feels like survival. False guilt also isolates. When you believe you are the recurring problem, you withdraw. You assume others see what you fear is true. You carry shame quietly, convinced that if you could just correct yourself enough, harmony would finally be permanent. But harmony built on self-erasure is not harmony. It is imbalance disguised as peace. The system remains comfortable because you remain burdened. And the more you carry, the lighter everyone else appears, not because they are free of fault, but because you are carrying more than your share. Yet here is the turning point. Guilt is only useful when it points to truth. When it is false, it is not a moral compass, it is a control mechanism. The moment you begin to question the source of your guilt, to ask whether it truly belongs to you, something shifts internally. You start to separate empathy from responsibility. You recognize that caring about others does not mean absorbing their emotional consequences. You realize that self-examination is healthy, but self-condemnation is not. You were never meant to be the emotional storage room for unresolved tension. The guilt you carried was learned, reinforced, and rehearsed, but it was not earned. And when you begin to put down what was never yours, you do not become careless or indifferent. You become balanced, you become clear. And in that clarity, the burden that once felt permanent begins to dissolve, revealing a truth that was always waiting beneath the weight. You were not the cause. You were the carrier, and you are allowed to set it down. Why truth-tellers become targets. There is something profoundly unsettling about a person who sees clearly in a room full of denial. Not because they are loud, not because they are aggressive, but because they are accurate. Truth has a quiet intensity to it. It does not need volume to be powerful. And when you were the one who sensed the inconsistencies, who noticed the contradictions between words and actions, who felt the emotional undercurrents others tried to ignore, you unintentionally disrupted a carefully maintained illusion. In environments where stability depends on pretending, the one who refuses to pretend becomes inconvenient. Truth-tellers often do not even realize they are playing that role. They simply respond honestly. If something feels unfair, they say so. If something hurts, they acknowledge it. If something does not make sense, they question it. But questioning can be threatening in systems built on hierarchy, fear, or fragile pride. Because when you ask a question, you invite accountability. And accountability requires self-reflection, something not everyone is willing to engage in. So instead of answering the question, the system redirects attention to the questioner. It becomes easier to label you as too intense than to admit that your observation was correct. Easier to describe you as overreacting than to confront the behavior that triggered your reaction. Slowly, the focus shifts away from the issue and onto your character. Your tone is dissected, your timing is criticized, your delivery is analyzed. Everything about how you spoke becomes the subject, except what you actually said. This redirection protects the illusion while isolating the one who disrupted it. What makes this dynamic especially painful is that truth-tellers are often deeply empathetic. They do not speak to control, they speak to resolve. They want clarity, not chaos. They want understanding, not dominance. But in a system that survives on silence, clarity feels like exposure, and exposure feels dangerous. So the one holding the mirror becomes the threat, not because they are malicious, but because they are reflective. Over time, being targeted for honesty can cause internal conflict. You begin to wonder whether silence would be safer. You question whether speaking up is worth the cost. You may even attempt to suppress your instincts, to dim your awareness in order to belong. But suppressing perception does not erase it, it only redirects it inward. And when awareness turns inward without expression, it often becomes self-doubt. Yet here is the deeper truth. You were not targeted because you were wrong. You were targeted because you were right in a space that was not ready for honesty. The discomfort others felt was not caused by your presence. It was caused by the reflection your presence created. And while that realization may not erase the hurt, it restores perspective. You were not too much. You were too real for an environment that preferred comfort over growth. When you understand this, something shifts within you. You no longer measure your worth by how comfortably you fit into denial. You no longer interpret resistance as proof of your flaw. You begin to see that your clarity was never the problem. It was the catalyst. And catalysts are rarely welcomed in spaces committed to staying the same. Breaking the invisible contract, stepping out of the role. There comes a moment, not loud, not dramatic, when something inside you grows tired. Tired of rehearsing apologies for things you did not do. Tired of adjusting your tone to avoid misunderstandings that were never truly about tone. Tired of carrying emotional weight that seems to regenerate no matter how much of it you try to resolve. This moment is subtle, but it is powerful. It is the beginning of awareness. And awareness is the first crack in what can only be described as an invisible contract. The unspoken agreement that you would continue playing the role assigned to you. The invisible contract was never signed consciously. You did not sit at a table and agree to be the absorber of blame, the regulator of everyone else's emotions, the stabilizer of fragile dynamics, but through repetition and expectation, the agreement formed. You learned that if you stayed quiet, conflict de-escalated faster. If you took responsibility, tension softened. If you apologized, even when uncertain, the atmosphere relaxed. So you adapted. Not because you were weak, but because you were intuitive. You sensed what was required to maintain connection and you provided it. But contracts built on self-erasure are not sustainable. Over time, you begin to notice that peace maintained at your expense is not peace at all. It is imbalance, and imbalance eventually demands correction. Breaking the invisible contract does not mean becoming combative. It does not mean seeking revenge or proving anyone wrong. It means withdrawing from a role that was never yours to carry. It means pausing before automatic apology. It means asking yourself, quietly and honestly, is this truly mine to fix? This shift can feel uncomfortable at first. When you stop over-functioning, others may feel the absence immediately. The system that relied on your constant emotional labor may react with confusion, resistance, even subtle attempts to pull you back into position. You may hear familiar phrases designed to remind you of your responsibility. But responsibility without reciprocity is not maturity. It is conditioning. And you are allowed to question conditioning. Stepping out of the role requires courage because it involves tolerating temporary discomfort. There may be tension when you no longer absorb it. There may be silence when you no longer fill it. There may be misunderstandings when you stop over-explaining yourself. But these reactions are not proof that you are wrong. They are evidence that the dynamic is changing. And change often feels destabilizing before it feels liberating. Reclaiming power without revenge. The quiet return to yourself. There is a final stage in this journey that does not look dramatic from the outside, yet it is the most powerful transformation of all. It is the moment you realize that reclaiming your power has nothing to do with proving anyone wrong. For a long time, you may have imagined that healing would come with a grand revelation, that one day they would finally see, finally admit, finally understand. But true restoration does not depend on confession or validation. It depends on detachment from the need for it, and that is where your power quietly returns. When you have lived as the scapegoat, there is often a hidden desire to clear your name, to present evidence, to reconstruct every misunderstood moment and lay it out with precision, not out of pride but out of exhaustion. You want the record corrected, you want your character restored. Yet the deeper truth is this: your character was never truly damaged. It was misrepresented within a limited narrative, and narratives maintained by denial rarely dissolve through debate. They dissolve when you stop participating in them. Reclaiming power without revenge means resisting the temptation to mirror the harm you endured. It means refusing to weaponize your awareness, even though you now see the patterns clearly. It means understanding that strength is not in retaliation, but in restraint. The greatest shift happens when you no longer react automatically to provocation. When blame is projected, you pause. When criticism resurfaces, you evaluate instead of absorb. You ask yourself calmly, is this mine? And if it is not, you let it pass without internalizing it. This kind of composure unsettles old dynamics more than confrontation ever could, because the system that once relied on your emotional reaction now encounters something different: steadiness. You are no longer defensive, no longer over-explaining, no longer scrambling to repair what was never yours to fix. You stand in your own understanding, and that quiet certainty is far more disruptive to dysfunction than anger. There is also a deeper healing that occurs internally. You begin to separate your identity from the role you once carried. You see yourself not as the difficult one or the sensitive one, but as perceptive, resilient, and emotionally aware. The traits that were once criticized become strengths when viewed outside the distorted lens of blame. Your sensitivity becomes intuition. Your questioning becomes discernment. Your refusal to pretend becomes integrity. Most importantly, you stop seeking permission to exist fully. You no longer need applause to confirm your worth. You no longer wait for acknowledgement to validate your experience. Your clarity becomes self-sustaining. And in that space, something extraordinary happens. Peace emerges, not the fragile peace you maintained by self-sacrifice, but a grounded peace rooted in self-respect. Reclaiming power without revenge is not passive, it is deliberate. It is choosing growth over bitterness. It is choosing boundaries over chaos. It is choosing inner alignment over external approval. And when you reach this stage, you realize something profound. The role they gave you no longer defines you. The blame they placed on you no longer shapes you. You are not rising to defeat anyone. You are rising to return to yourself. And that return, steady, dignified, and complete, is the most powerful statement you will ever make.